I'll be addressing the micro side of using data for decision-making based on some specific scenarios that I've encountered at UTSA. UTSA has a strong commitment to seamless fulfillment. It's really one of our service priorities, and also a pretty empirical mindset. So that meant we looked at our materials budget, which is presently flat and has been for a couple of years, and looked at the circulation rates for materials that we'd acquired through traditional acquisitions. And for the past few years, that's been about 17%. 17% of titles circulate for our approval auto ships, and more like about 25% for slips and firm orders. So that suggested to us a lot of speculative purchasing that has yet to really realize a payoff in terms of use. And the library thought it could improve its return on investment by incorporating more demand-driven strategies into its repertoire. We have a demand-driven ebook profile of about 250,000 titles, and we have about 7,500 serial titles available for on-demand article acquisition. The peril of unmediated programs is obviously their potential for uncontrolled costs. When we examine our demand-driven programs, we're trying to look beyond the basic kind of cost per use data that libraries all collect. So we're looking to this data for evidence of how different research areas and different types of users are using the library, how our discovery infrastructure is working or in some cases not working, whether the services we're providing are working optimally up to their potential, and whether we're putting our money in the right places with respect to our service objectives. One very tangible benefit of our Articles on Demand program is that it has given us a window into an emerging research area for the university. So about a year ago, ILL was restructured into acquisitions, and at the same time, the library started up its unmediated article purchasing program. This brought in a flood of new data about article requests that had really never been seen or studied before in this way, and what it showed us was very interesting. Fall 2014 was our first real glimpse of what peak use looked like. And after the sticker shock wore off, the first thing we noticed was how many journals in clinical medicine were on the transaction report. This struck us as very odd because UTSA doesn't have a medical school, and we have a few faculty with joint appointments to the UTSA, or to the University of Texas Medical Center in San Antonio, but not enough to generate the kind of demand that we were seeing. Like interlibrary loan, about a third of the use comes from faculty and 2/3 from students, indicating that faculty are disproportionately active users of the service relative to their total numbers on campus. We also looked more closely at the specific articles being requested, especially for the highest use titles whose cost through the on-demand program was rapidly approaching and in some cases exceeding the cost of a subscription. When we isolated the high-use titles, which included not just these 10, but also many of the clinical journals we had wondered about, we discovered that most of them were supporting research in kinesiology. This is a new program for the university, and it doesn't yet have a very well-developed relationship with the libraries. And we also saw a lot of activity around PTSD and traumatic brain injury, which are huge research areas in San Antonio because of the presence of a large military medical center. We also looked at our ILL transactions for this over the same period and saw similar kinds of requests there. So having verified that this was legitimate use in program areas that were apparently not being well supported by the existing collection, we moved quickly to convert those highest use titles into subscriptions in order to contain those ongoing costs and also to improve support for those program areas. We learned a few lessons from the first year of Get It Now. The first was that convenience is really, really important to our users. If we make resources readily discoverable and make fulfillment avenues easy to find and convenient to use, the demand is going to be there. We shouldn't expect new acquisition models to replace existing ones, at least not at first. When you implement a new program like this, what you might find is that instead of it offsetting other work, as it did here, you find that the new model finds a new audience or fulfills previously unmet needs that you were unaware of. And finally, it's important to be aware that unmediated on-demand access can circumvent the library's traditional avenues for identifying demand, such as faculty approaching a subject librarian about journals in their area. Until we started looking closely at our transaction reports to figure out why our costs were so high and why people were using these journals that we didn't expect them to be using, we weren't aware of how much research was going on in new areas like kinesiology. And if our fulfillment mechanisms are convenient enough and our users are satisfied enough, it could have been a very long time before we ever heard about this need through sort of the conventional channels. And this is significant because on-demand delivery to individual users is a very inefficient way to acquire content. And it's also a way that doesn't do anything to develop the collection over the long term. So the message that we took away from that is that we need to really, really watch these data pretty much in real time and make sure that we're using this on-demand article fulfillment where it's appropriate and pursuing other avenues where it's not. UTSA supports a large and vigorous DDA program for ebooks, and the data that emerges from that program is probably the most closely studied in the library. Our DDA program is through EBL, and like Get It Now, it's also fully unmediated. So one aspect of EBL's business model is the short-term loan, in which the cost is set by the publisher at some percentage of the list price, and it varies by publisher. We're currently using a threshold of 4 loans, so upon the 5th loan, a purchase is made. The library has a fair amount of control over the profile, so we can add and remove publishers or specific titles and set cost, date, and language filters, those kinds of criteria. We're also able to get quite detailed data on individual transactions, usage patterns, and expenditures. Although our profile is enormous, and as a consequence, so is our potential exposure, here's how this model has worked for us in practice over the life of the program. So that large orange segment is the titles in our profile that have never been used. No one's ever touched them. And this is about 85% of them. Another 10% have been used only once, and the numbers just diminish farther from there. Titles that get to 4 uses almost all make it to the point of purchase. So once it's been used 4 times, it's more likely than not going to be used 5 times. But this is still a very small segment of our total use. About 7% of titles that are ever used get purchased. So this is clearly an effective model for us. We end up paying more for the purchased titles because they incur short-term loan costs prior to the purchase, but the vast majority of the use is happening at a fraction of the list price. Cost-wise, this is how the program has looked for us over the past few years. It was steady and predictable for a long time, and everybody was pleased. And then suddenly this year, DDA started eating up its budget allocation much faster than we had anticipated. That's alarming, right? What's going on? So we looked more closely at our expenditures, and we found this. Our usage has been more or less consistent year over year. The average cost of a short-term loan is not. Some of what you're seeing here is us trimming the non-scholarly materials out of our profile. And those things generally have a cheaper, a lower cost, but they're also things we just don't need in our profile, period. But mostly what you're seeing here in 2015 is publishers trying to figure out how to price their product in the marketplace. And I really don't think this kind of correction is done yet. So unfortunately, this blew apart our projections, but we make data-driven decisions and not emotional ones, so we didn't panic yet. It became clear that if we really wanted to contain costs, we weren't going to be able to do it at the fringes. If we actually wanted to stop the hemorrhage of money, we would have to pull back the content that people actually wanted and were using. And we didn't want to do that. So the other alternative is we could tinker with our short-term loan threshold, and we did do some of that at the highest end of the cost spectrum. But the overall pattern of use was unchanged, and so reducing the number of allowable loans is just going to create more purchases. So ultimately, we left that profile more or less as it was. These are titles that people want, and if we pull them back from the program, we're taking titles that people want and use and putting a barrier between the content and the user. At least we know that every single one of the purchases happened because somebody wanted to use the material. In the end, just as with rising short-term loan costs, we kept the profile as it was and sought other avenues for funding the program. This experience has given us a chance to better align our resources with our service priorities. We know that our DDA program is cost-effective. Every cost is associated with use, and the majority of uses cost a small fraction of the purchase price. The usage is robust, and we have many returning users that come back semester after semester to use our ebooks. This program has been operating on its own fund allocation, but we do have LC classification data from the vendor for the vast majority of the titles. So we analyzed those expenditures by subject area and took that information to the subject librarians. I think some were very surprised to see how much material was being purchased through this program in their subject areas. To their credit, instead of viewing this as kind of an incursion into their collection development activities, many were surprisingly willing to shift their funds from their subject areas once they saw that DDA was clearly benefiting the constituents they work most closely with. I think we still have many lessons to learn from our DDA data. For example, we haven't really explored in any detail what content is getting the most repeat use, which publishers, which subject areas, which time periods, et cetera, and how we might capitalize on that information. What we have learned is that rising costs, while they might be hard to swallow, don't necessarily undermine the efficacy of the program. Ebooks are a volatile market, and I don't think we can necessarily rely on any particular model very far into the future, no matter how well it's working now. And I believe a data-driven posture is probably the best defense against changes in the marketplace, because it means you're keeping track of how a program is performing and being aware of the systemic pressures on that service, and can be flexible and pragmatic when circumstances require a change of course. The other takeaway from this, and perhaps the one that surprised me the most, is how easy it is to think of demand-driven programs as being somehow separate from other collection development activities. In reality, they're resources like any other that support the institution and its teaching and research areas. And I think our subject librarians have been very clear-sighted to perceive this as a supplemental purchasing avenue and also a valuable source of information about how their users are behaving and what they want from the library, rather than a budget cut. Data can also show us how closely use is tied to discoverability. Through the UT system, as well as on its own, UTSA participated in an evidence-based selection program with Elsevier. For an upfront cost, the library gets access to some pool of titles for a year, and at the end of the year, the library can look at its usage and select which titles it would like to purchase up to the upfront cost of the program. Analyzing this kind of program is a little trickier than a conventional ebook package because there are multiple variables to consider. There's the total cost of the program and whether that's affordable. There's the scope of the pool and what you want your users to have access to in the short term. And then there's the library's long-term access needs. UTSA had very good success with Elsevier's program. We also participated in a similar program with another vendor that didn't go as well. One of our chief complaints in that case was the lack of data. I came from a metadata background, and I often wish that the availability and quality of metadata from a provider figured more prominently into library decisions, because it means the provider fundamentally understands the discovery ecosystem. And in this case, it was crucial to the success or the failure of the program. Elsevier's EBS was a case where participating in a consortium was very beneficial for us. It opened up a larger pool of titles than UTSA could have afforded on its own, but the component libraries still were able to get their own usage statistics. At the end of the access period, the consortium selected the most used titles kind of across the board, but also left some amount of funds available to each of the component schools to add in any further titles that had seen a lot of use from their individual institution. For UTSA's evidence-based selection program, we brought some older engineering titles into the pool that we had lost from another package, but that we anticipated would continue to get use. For this kind of decision, it was very helpful to have institutional knowledge of the electronic resources in this discipline and knowledge of where the demand would be. Because the evidence-based model has an access component and a purchase component, it's also important for the library to understand what it needs in the way of perpetual access. Depending on the magnitude of those needs, it may be more or less important to negotiate for advantageous pricing on the titles that you purchase at the end of the period. This may be stating the obvious, but I've seen decision makers fall into the trap of believing that number crunching is the only way to be kind of analytically rigorous. Being a data-driven organization doesn't mean decisions are based solely on statistics or that personal knowledge and institutional history have no bearing on a problem. It's true that the more data the library has, the more subtle and far-reaching its analysis can be, but the data itself is value neutral. For any of the scenarios I've just described, there are many equally valid ways for a library to respond, each informed by its particular conditions. When faced with escalating costs, UTSA decided to reallocate funds into these program areas rather than restrict access, guided by an overarching service philosophy. Another organization, equally data-driven, might have concluded that the financial exposure was unacceptable and either retooled or discontinued the programs. Only by considering that information in light of the organization's values and priorities were we able to arrive at a course of action.